In this video, I will outline what I believe to be the final nail in the coffin of this farcical and banal theory that we can have good faith or neutral discourse. So what I want to do is basically go through why this is going to be the turning point, hopefully, in our dropping of the pretense that anyone can be neutral or habitating the right place in the discussion from a point of view where there is no bias. And doing so, I'll use some presuppositions from Max Weber and Carl Schmitt, as well as my fairly regular occurrence from Oswald Spengler on this. Basically, to give some introduction here, Weber had this idea, particularly from a lecture series he did called Politics as a Vocation, where he outlined exactly what he meant in terms of a ethics of responsibility. So that is when we think about what is the social and political normative function of you and your position and your thoughts and your beliefs, and how we can then transmit that into what a politician is allowed to position themselves as and what they should focus upon in their role and responsibility, and that we will always lead down this road to tyrannical democracy, or at least a Governor Caesar-like democracy. In general, you could think of Schmitt as being not a protege of Weber by any means, but an offshoot, perhaps in a way that's maybe heterodox in a lot of circles, because he considers the politics from the other side, but still resembling the tyrannical and polarizing effect of politics, in that if you induce a system of collectivization, so social society, in a way that it forms a government, the government will always bend toward the top, and the not necessarily despot effect, but you'll have what is a leader, and that leader is effectively the sovereign, and then from that we can then understand enemies, force, power, friends, or those distinctions. And Schmitt likes to call these, I do have it here, but the neutralization of values. So having this set of values that's assumed to be neutral, that we just treat everything from a starting point where there's no belief, there's no axiomatic thought process that went into forming the idea or the valuation. And he's obviously dismissive of this because it's farcical that we would pretend there is no, there is neutrality, that there is no bias. So what I'll do then is I'll just read first this subsect of Decline of the West by Spengler here, who on this subject he calls the same sentiment morale, and he says, "We are now at last in a position to approach the phenomenon of morale, the intellectual interpretation of life by itself, to ascend the height from which it is possible to survey the wildest and gravest of all the fields of human thought. At the same time, we shall need for this survey of an objectivity such as no one has as yet himself seriously to gain. Whatever we may take morale to be, it is no part of morale to provide its own analysis, and we shall get to grips with the problem, not by considering what should be our acts, aims, and standards, but only by diagnosing the Western feeling in the very form of the Annunciation. In this matter of morale, Western mankind, without exception, is under the influence of an immense optical illusion. Everyone demands something of the rest. We say, thou shalt, in the conviction that so-and-so, in fact, will, can, and must be changed or fashioned or arranged comfortably to the order, and our belief, both in the efficacy of and in our title to give such orders, is unshakable. That, and nothing short of it, is, for us, morale. In the ethics of the West, everything is direction, claim to power, will to affect the distant. Here, Luther is completely at one with Nietzsche, popes with Darwinians, socialists with Jesuits, for one and all. In the beginning of morale is a claim to general permanent validity. Let me just slow it. it is a necessity of the Faustian soul that this should be so. And so, in understanding that, I think it's fairly evident that Spengler was also of this opinion that the congruence from life lived in a Faustian realm to a politicized life is one and the same. And that there is a metaphysical overarching guiding principle, or like you could say, a capstone almost, that we are endeavoring towards, or at least under. And so when we consider the metaphysics of our position, and the opinions that we form are just the bearings of us in our own realities to get to grips with how we feel and think using this overarching, not even ideology, but as I say, metaphysics, it becomes much clearer as to why people take positions that they do. And we could talk a little bit more about that as we go on here. But I think it's to say, first of all, that no one goes into any of these discussions with no conceptions and no axioms and no presuppositions. It's very clear that we predicate almost all conversations on a certain set of beliefs in this realm of understanding, and that good faith as an idea is a bit of, I would not say bollocks, but it's baloney from the sense that it was only ever illustrative for someone's intentions to signal or counter-signal how open-minded and liberal they were. Everyone previously already understood certain people would come in with political thought in a way that was already predetermined what stance you would take on most issues. Now, that could probably have been not much clearer than when with William Buckley, a chap down here who hosted something called Firing Line. You can watch old episodes if you wanted to. He's a conservative transatlantic commentariat, basically, who liked to, I would say, be fairly objective in his stances towards his interviewees, and this did range from anyone on the far left to the far right, which in those days was very much USSR aligned, or American Reagan style alignment from a political perspective. And so, but his disposition was very clear and evident, and he never made any he never minced his words on that. I think it was very easy to understand that that was his position, and that would always be his position. Then we have an offshoot of what was the new, you could say, post, well, Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history, but this post end of history, and I don't want to call them journalists, but talking head, where you have Andrew Neil and Louis Theroux, and then in America, the last 2 decades, you've had these sort of pestilential talking heads, which offer not much in the way of value, but much in the way of bias and opinion. And then obviously with the new age of streaming, this phase of media and internet personalities, you have also the fairly insufferable streamer types, myself notwithstanding, and also podcasts. And in this, we try to form what I would consider this miasma, or a maybe sphere, which we can then understand as being wholly political in the conceptual sense. So everything they talk about and do, and the way they comment on anything, is always from a political stance, which I think is probably naturally right, but I think it can be very annoying to have to always contextualize all your opinions in the way that, because I'm a leftist, because I'm a liberal, because I'm a Christian, because I'm an X, this is why I think this, rather than having a deeper, more profound metaphysical starting point whereby you can't necessarily pigeonhole someone on topics so easily. But obviously these men and women become almost not gimmicks, but reflexive, and that it's easy to know their opinions on a topic because at a guess they're going to hold ex-conservative mainstream opinion with some garnish on top, which might put a interesting spin on it, or whatever it might have you. And in general, I think that that's how we've gone into the 2020s in this very, I would say, disappointing realm of narrowed echo chamber-like facilities of discussion. And so no one wants to watch someone they don't agree with, basically, because it becomes very annoying. And then on the opposite hand of that, you almost hate watch things in that stance of like, I already disagree with this person and I know what they're going to say is something I'm going to disagree with. And you more or less contribute to what I consider this spiraling effect, and it can be thought of as discouraging for, I don't want to call it neutral because it's not, but open discourse. And that's what I think we should probably preface the entire thing to saying, let's be open to hearing people's stances. Now, obviously, most of these people are functionally retarded, but in the way that we would like to engage with maybe the ideas that they stand in front of and try to work through them rather than having to address them themselves. And I think there's two deeper meanings to this, and we can go into it a bit deeper with how we understand nihilism, and that there's this constant threat of meaning and having to find meaning, and this is going to put a lot of complex pressure on certain people's psyche, in that if you don't have necessarily a baked-in meaning to your life and you're required to build one a la carte, it can be difficult to know where to start and know if you're on the right track. And it's much easier to just borrow someone else's opinions. We like to be, and fundamentally most humans are very lazy, so we'll gravitate towards being given opinions that necessarily come with a lot of weight behind them, and we can go, yes, this is the right position to take. I'm guilty myself of things like this, but the more culpable you are is the less questioning you are. And I wouldn't even necessarily say the less well-read, because sometimes an open mind is too open and things will just fall out. Whereas I think you should be at least very discerning when you read things, and when you choose to put yourself into discussions, that you are taking the most open version of the discussion. And I don't like good faith as the description, because I don't think necessarily we should treat all discussions on the equivalent grounds of, everyone's got something worthwhile to say, and the way they say it is not important, but just we should read into what their messages are. I think there should be a minimum requirement for discourse and dialogue, and that if you are coming to a duel and you bring a wet noodle instead of a sword, then you should be dealt with beforehand, rather than necessarily still being able to participate in what is a farcical promotional show. And for all intents and purposes, it fosters no good discussion. It's just for entertainment value. And if you're looking for entertainment, then obviously that's completely fine, but I don't think it necessarily means we should think about it as contributing to total inculcation in a positive way. In any case, I'll read here what Max Weber has to say in relation to this. We must be clear about the fact that all ethically oriented conduct may be guided by one of two fundamentally differing and irreconcilably opposed maxims. Conduct can be oriented to an ethic of ultimate ends or to an ethic of responsibility. This is not to say that an ethic of ultimate ends is identical with irresponsibility, or that an ethic of responsibility is identical with unprincipled opportunism. Naturally, nobody says that. However, there is an abysmal contrast between conduct that follows the maxim of an ethic of ultimate ends. That is, in religious terms, the Christian does rightly and leaves the result with the Lord, and conduct that follows the maxim of an ethic of responsibility, in which case one has to give an account of the foreseeable results of one's action. And this is where we can probably lean towards the latter. I think Weber obviously hoping that you do, in the sense that you want to make sure you own and have full responsibility of your position, and your ethics to that should just be a reflection of your lack of cowardice and total culpability of a position in itself. If you're going to hold an opinion, you need to be liable and be challenged on that to the degree that you're willing to contest it. It can't be such a flimsy and unthought out stance that you're going to hold, because then you're only holding it for the sake of filling a gap in your opinion bank, rather than necessarily holding or forming an opinion in that space, which holds value to both yourself, but then also when you are discussing ideas, the interaction is better for it because you've actually thought that position through. It's the difference between a chimerical idea and a real idea, I would say, in that sense. We can probably also think about it a little bit mathematically in an information space and how we can share, we call it data nowadays, but just in general how we share ideas and concepts and information with each other. You don't want to have pre-formulaic things here because it does not engender goodwill in an opponent. And an opponent here is definitely, if you're going into what is a debate, and these are fashioned quite commonly on the internet, then you want to be able to engage with them on the level that's agreed. And I think that's maybe where the good faith idea should be reduced to. It's just, you can have a set of rules and understanding that if we're going to talk about a topic, you should at least be educated to a sufficient level to discuss it, rather than just parroting terms and opining on things you know nothing of. That, I think, is at least a fairly defensible stance when it comes to the debate here. The notion that things are always political, I think, is also fairly true. I think you should be able to evidence this, and I've obviously taken just the top 10 here of a podcast, but when you go into listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, you already know his disposition. You know that he will approach things from a certain angle, and that can be good. I think if you like him and you find him entertaining, then that's nice. But I think then opposite to that is maybe you just want to hear what the guest thinks in a way that isn't clouded by a certain judgment or has any preconception of what it is that will be talked about. It's just you tell me and then I tell you how I already think and how that clashes with my preconceived notions on things. And that's fine. I think that that's probably why he's one of the highest rated, is because his perspective is not necessarily neutral, but it's inoffensive and it's very, I would say, open-minded. And that's almost what you'll get in terms of good faith. You'll have, in maybe RPG terms, a very chaotic neutral, or this neutrality and alignment to the degree of the conversation at hand is not maybe being challenged in a way always that's having to have such stark political aims and outcomes. Now, I know he advocated for first JFK and then Trump thereafter, but I think that was probably more of a product of the interactions he had rather than his existing political conceptions of what things he would choose, versus someone like Ben Shapiro or this guy, I can't remember his name, Destiny, in that they will have a position which is very evident at the start of the conversation that they're going to take, and almost every part of their gimmick is aligned to entertainment because they're performative for their own crowd. You like the way that they do things and then you watch them do those things. It's very monkey dance kind of edutainment or something like that, you might call it. But it's very hard to be illuminated in these conversations, and mostly it is reduced to a yelling match or some other unsophisticated dance. It would be nice, I think, if the elevation of discourse went to the level of metaphysics, where you had people challenging them on the underpinnings of the ideas of your entire political being. Why is it that you consider yourself a liberal or like a progressive or a Christian Democrat or a conservative Jew? What is it about that your stance and your being predisposes you to these conditions? Why is it that you stand there and advocate these things out of hand, basically, and will maintain such ardent positions on certain subjects, particularly when it's very clear that most of them don't understand why they believe the things that they do, other than that they are the things that they believe. It's a very unquestioning, spookified way to live, and I think it's probably just a product of what we consider entertaining is not necessarily a reflection of very smart people talking about subjects, but more about if you say things in a certain way, then people will enjoy that content. That's a very Louis Theroux style of journalism, but in general, talking head. The second part to this is obviously where Schmitt takes the I would say, equivalent stance on the other side of the same view, which is to say you can have a parallax or opposite parallax, which is still imbricating in the same object. So it's just a convergence almost here of angles to actually get the same thought and idea, even though the starting point was completely different. And so Schmitt goes on to say the term point of attack carries with it the potential aggressiveness that is immanent in each value attribution. Terms like standpoint or viewpoint divert one's attention and give the impression of an apparently limitless relativism, relationism, and perspectivism, and concomitantly of as great a tolerance joint to a fundamental neutrality. Before long, however, one becomes aware of the fact that here, too, the points of attack are at work, dispersing the illusions of neutrality. One may try to neutralize the term point of attack, in the sense of recasting it into a weaker formulation such as starting point, for instance. That would soften only the uncomfortable representation, though, while leaving the imminent aggressiveness untouched. The latter remains the fatal, seamy side of values. The aggressiveness is the logical consequence of the thetic and subjective essences of values, and it renews itself continuously through their practical enactment. Likewise, the distinction between value law and statutory law does not do away with the aggressiveness, but rather intensifies it. Because of the ambivalence of values, that aggressiveness will not cease to renew its virulence whenever values as such are brought by actual people to bear upon other people as real as they. And a lot of people dislike Schmitt and Schmittian positions, I think, because of his history and the way he lived his life was questionable to a lot of people in this moral sphere. But he did, and I would say almost never broke from his traditional thinking around law, legality, and how the jurisprudence, which is the combination of law from a metaphysical and ethical point of view, can be structured. And so with this coherence, I think it's clear for us that you can approach the same idea here, which is this good faith discourse nonsense, with the idea that it was never, and there was no existence of it to begin with. We've always just approached ideas politically, and if politically, then in a way that was biased, and biased to our own perception and or ignorance. You can be biased by your own ignorance in that way. There are these thought experiments that you can go through to understand this a little bit better. I think the famous one being the Chinese room, where we're not sure if the translation is a known translation rather than just a systematic and mechanical translation of a certain thing. So you pass through a Chinese phrase and it comes out in English on the other side, and in the middle there was a translation, and it's about whether we know that the translation was understood to the level that you could judge it worthy of its essence to be maintained, and the person who was doing it had an idea of what was being said in the from a Aeneid to a concrete sense. And that's how we get these morphological changes in political discourse. You form them using the preconceived notions around topics, the axioms that you hold in these ways. And if we can think of things semiotically, then we are garnering impressions all the time, all these inferences that we have around all the books that we read and the media that we are imbibing, and then eventually it coalesces and it starts to crystallize in our own thoughts and processes and dispositions. And that's when you build up into who you are and what you believe. And this is what we call maturing in a lot of ways. I think the final thing here is, if you're building up a lot of your thoughts and notions and knowledge from people who are so spookified, it's almost a derivation of the spook. So it's a spook of a spook, and that can be very dangerous. And I think it inhibits your growth as a person, but also, as I said, you want to be able to engage in discourse in a way that you're functionally the most capable of winning. I think everything is a contest of wills in this way, and you want to be the one who wins. And ultimately, this is what goes into Spengler's socialism. It's that there's an overarching will of the people that we all want you to behave in my one thought and way. And this is why a king and a sovereign is necessarily the most powerful, because their version of socialism is the way that everyone should behave. And that's where we get from the political discourse all the way from the bottom to the top. So lastly, I think it's important that we conjoin this understanding with the nihilism that once you realize most of these people don't have values because they don't actually or haven't thought existentially, why am I here? What is my purpose here? They usually tie it towards a preconceived notion of purpose and being. Then you see, okay, most of these people are not worth listening to, because if you had to actually drill deeper and deeper down, there was a recursion all the way down to the bedrock of your belief. To say, why are you the way that you are? They probably wouldn't have thought about it. And if they had, it's too much of a coward to actually buy into something in an earnest and genuine way. And so that's why you get what I would say is insincere debate, is because the people participating in a lot of these conversations are just themselves cowards and insincere people.